Okay, it's 2 o'clock. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to all of you for joining us for this Public and Nonprofit Management Annual Conference. And my name is Ted Benavides, and I'm the MPA Director for the Public and Nonprofit Management Program here at the university. I'm honored to welcome you to our local government panel, and this is our 5th conference. Our program was established in 1990, and we've been training public and nonprofit leaders for the last 30 years, quite successfully. We offer a bachelor's, a master's, and a doctoral degrees. We also have 4 graduate certificates that we offer, and we are, very successful, and our students are actively and professors are actively involved in research and community service. It's evidenced by our numerous national awards, grants, and publications. In fact, the U.S. World and News Report ranks our program in public affairs #1 in North Texas, 3rd in the state, and 58th nationally. We're thrilled to have you with us, and today we look forward to a great panel. But before I do start off the panel, I want to let you know that Dr. McCaskill has asked me to do a little chore for him, so I'm going to try to do that, and hopefully I don't destroy the system here. Let's see if I can get it done. Dr. McCaskill has asked me to introduce the inductees for our Honor Society of Public Administration and Public Affairs, known as Pi Alpha Alpha, to be inducted into the 2021 program. You have to, if you're a graduate student, you need a GPA of 3.7, and if you're an undergraduate, you need a GPA of 3.5. I guess that explains why I was never allowed in the society. So let me call out the names of our proud inductees this year. Juan Aguilar, Famida Begum, DePaul Chaudhry, Caitlin Colby, Christopher Guidry, Rebecca Higgs, Ziad Karat, Michaela Kraft, Reem Salem, and Lena Uring. So everybody give them a warm round of applause for their great success and getting into the Pi Alpha Alpha Honor Society. So I will tell you that Dr. McCaskill was able to make me an honorary member because he said that's the only way I was going to get in. So I do appreciate him doing that. So without further ado, let's go back to the panel. And today's government panel is going to address the same issues that were addressed in the nonprofit and the keynote, which is diversity, equity, inclusion, and economic equity. And to help us today, we have 3 fabulous panelists, Liz Cideo Pedea, Aretha Farrell Benavides, and Trudy Lewis. And let me give them proper introductions that their moms would be proud of. So I'm going to start off with Liz, and currently she's the Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer for the City of Dallas, a place that I got to work for 25 years, and I hope she's having as much fun there as I did. Her portfolio includes the Office of Environmental Quality and Sustainability, the Office of Equity and Inclusion, Resilience Equity, Human Rights, Fair Housing, Immigrant Affairs, the Office of Ethics, and the 311 Customer Service for the City of Dallas. I think her boss, T.C. Broadnex, the city manager, didn't want her to have any idle time. So prior to, she started at the City of Dallas running the Office of Welcoming Communities and Immigrant Affairs. But prior to joining the Dallas management team, she served in the Obama administration. She was a senior advisor to the Director of Immigration and Custom Enforcement in the Department of Homeland Security. And she calls herself a proud Dallasite, and she has her law degree from Southern Methodist University. So welcome Liz to the panel. Next, we have Aretha R. Farrell Benavides. She's currently the city manager of Duncanville, Texas. She started her career in government service as an intern working for the city of Fort Worth, where her mom worked in the manager's office. Her next government job was, everybody pay attention, she worked for the CIA when she was in college. She was a Russian analyst, and they were all laid off when the Cold War ended. Since Russia's acting up again, they probably could use Aretha's skills again. She also worked for the governor's office in Maryland. She worked for the city of Sunnyvale, California, and she worked for the city of Washington, D.C. 3 times for 3 different mayors. She had different department head jobs, but the 2 that I enjoyed the most was she was the chief administrative officer for Parks and Recreation. But finally, the last job she had was she was deputy secretary of state for the district, and her job duties included the protocol office. So she got invited to all the really fun embassy parties. And if you ever get to meet her, ask her about the Russian parties where the vodka flowed freely. So I wouldn't know anything about that. I was never invited. So she also worked for the city of Chicago in their IT department. She worked in the Chicago Housing Authority, and she worked for 2 counties, Prince George's in Maryland and Los Alamos County, New Mexico. She then, Mayor Gray didn't win an election about 7 years ago in Washington, D.C., she came back to Texas. She became an assistant city manager in Glen Heights and manager then Glen Heights. She then moved on to be manager of Petersburg, Virginia, and now she's returned to Texas to be city manager of Duncanville, Texas. She has a BA from Southern, and she has an MPA and International Affairs degree from Howard University. So welcome, Aretha. Next is Trudy Lewis. She's the administrator for the city of Hutchins, Texas. She started out at the city of Irving and moved on to bigger things at the city of Arlington. When the city of Glen Heights was looking for somebody young and vibrant to be the city manager of their city, they plucked her from the city of Arlington and had her be city manager of Glen Heights. She then left the city of Glen Heights after a successful stint there to become the district director for the 30th United States Congressional District, which is served by the Honorable Eddie Bernice Johnson, a powerhouse in North Texas. But she got the itch to go back to local government, and so she went back to be the city administrator of Hutchins, Texas. She has her bachelor's degree from Spelman College in Georgia. She has an MPA from UT Dallas, yay. She's currently working on her PhD at Valdosta State University. But more importantly, she serves as one of our MPA advisory board members, where she's trying to guide us to even greater heights. And the faculty thinks that Trudy is one of the biggest stars we've ever produced. But that's been called into question lately when she told me the other day that she thought that Dr. Kyle, my colleague, was the most fabulous professor on the faculty. Trudy, I'm not sure about that. But everybody's entitled to their opinion, okay? But you did hurt my feelings, okay? I'm gonna ask questions of all my panelists, and I'm gonna start off in alphabetical order and then rotate it start with a new person for every new question. Also, if the audience has questions, you can put them in the chat box. In about 45 minutes, we'll open those up and ask those of the panelists as well. So let's begin with Liz. And the first question is, what kind of diversity, equity, inclusion training do you require of your managerial team and employees? And Liz, we can start with you.
Well, thank you, Ted, and thank you for your years of service at the City of Dallas. It's a pleasure to carry on the strong tradition that you have made such a contribution towards. So thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone on the line. Happy Friday. And although I did not get my degree from UTD, a daughter has, and she's done it twice. So some of our money has gone to UT Dallas. So go Comets. I am just really fortunate to be at as Ted said, I'm a proud Dallasite. I did not imagine myself to go into public service. Specifically, when I went to law school, I practiced immigration law for most of my career, and that, as he said, led me to serve at the national level. And then I had the opportunity to come back to my hometown. Has just been a phenomenal privilege and an honor. So grateful to be working in TC Broadnax's team. TC Broadnax, as I mentioned, is my boss. He's the city manager at Dallas, and he has been since 2017. He joined February, and I was brought in March. And TC brought with him a real spirit of equity and inclusion, and had made that a priority of his as a city manager in Tacoma, Washington, and made it inculcated into city life, starting at all levels, but really in terms of equity and inclusion, embedded it into the values. We have 4 values, and 2 of them, well, all of them are very important, but things that I do on a daily basis, which is lead the equity team, as well as ethics, and of course, excellence and empathy. And that's really where it starts, is being empathetic, I think, for all of our residents. What I've heard from TC early on is like really just focus on those people, not only those who will call you to make complaints, but also those who will never think to call you. Focus on uplifting the vulnerable. And so long stories to say that we have built up our program of equity and inclusion, over the past 4 years. And as equity and inclusion, I like to say that it's a bit of social justice, it's a bit of civil rights, it's a bit of inclusion, and it's a bit of understanding the people whom you serve and that you're thinking of on a daily basis. And so our work is really looking at policy development, the policies, the practices, and program development that we have at the city with an equity lens. And so that is where I focus on, and all of our managers are now being required to understand what it means to have an equity lens. And so from the very start, we brought in consultants, the Government Alliance for Racial Equity, to train senior leadership on the principles of equity and inclusion, and over time developed an equity core team consisting of all forms of city staff, from people who are not managers to people who are managers, people who are directors, etc. They meet on a quarterly basis with our equity officer and develop programs that they believe are going to uplift all of our employees and all of the backgrounds. Right now, we're celebrating AAPI month, Asian American Pacific Islander month, and so our ERGs and our Office of Equity and Inclusion, our Welcoming Communities and Immigrant Affairs Office, have a whole number of programs that are going on throughout the month to uplift and amplify the contributions that Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders are making every day. And so important, as we know, during this time when we have seen an uprise and uptick in anti-Asian American Pacific Islander sentiment. And we saw it from the very beginning of the pandemic, but now we have seen it with violent acts being committed against them on a national scale, but also we understand it at a state and local level. So our goal is to be there to support, amplify, and encourage others to speak out and give them resources, provide resources so that people know where to report crimes against hate, and work with our public safety officers on ways that we can reach communities. So our work is internal, it's external, but it's always ongoing, dynamic, and sort of moving to meet the needs of our everyday lives, but also the moments that we find ourselves in with the social unrest, with the civil rights reawakening, with the deaths of, with the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, trying to keep ourselves aware of disparities that have occurred over time and responding to them through policies, practices, and programs.
Thank you, Liz. Aretha?
There you go. As I started saying, how do you follow that? I mean, that was absolutely spectacular. You know, what I will say for us is I've been in a couple of organizations, and the last 3 organizations all had unique challenges. And, you know, one of the things that Mr. Benavides didn't point out is the reason I got to really get in city management and get back to Texas was Ms. Trudy Lewis offered me a job as a deputy city manager working for her. And one of the things that I will say that stuck in my head early on as an African-American female, that she was willing to hire another female. And we were actually in an organization that, although it had a population of city managers in the past that were African Americans and a couple of department heads, I think under her leadership, there was a lot of focus on really building a different type of environment. One of the things that we do here in Duncanville from a training standpoint is that we actually have a leadership institute. We have someone who is on contract for the city for a mid-management and a senior management training institute. And we talk about a number of different topics. One of the challenges the current city I have is that it's historically not been a very diverse organization, but with changing times, it has been a push toward making those changes happen. And through our training program, we have a monthly discussion on topics. And these topics include, you know, looking at the organization from a different standpoint and making sure that people include. So we have both a senior level, but also a mid-level management institute that they will graduate from. And so that has been a big push. Do we require it across the board? No, but one of the things that we've realized, specifically given the challenges that we're seeing today, is that there is a greater need for teaching, understanding differences and where their differences go. I always tell people when I would be asked this question in interviews when they ask it, is my real introduction came as about 10 years ago, the city of Longview was interested in doing a program for all of their staff on diversity. And I came up with a decision that I wanted to talk about differences. And so I created a session called Celebrating Differences. And it was really just focus on differences beyond race and color, but also religious and other things, and creating a level of understanding of, although there are differences, there are things that we're alike, and how the changing environment of that has come about. And so those are the types of programs that I think are beneficial. But when I'm in an interview and they ask that question, as I say, people train, but they don't necessarily do. So we've got to look beyond just what we're doing in our training, but look at our policies. What do we see in our policies? What do we see on our applications that basically create some type of psychological bias when we're looking at recruitment? What do our brochures look like that are geared toward recruiting people to our organization that may make someone think that they're not welcome there? And so those are some of the focuses we do.
Thank you. Trudy?
Well, Ted, if I can say in my own defense, I've never had you as a professor. So there was no way I could consider you to be the best professor, although I had Dr. Kyle several times. It's so great to see you, Aretha, even though it is virtual. I haven't seen you in years. It is fantastic to see you this afternoon. So one of the things that is incredibly important for our organization, for the city of Hutchins, is that we understand that many initiatives, who you are and your culture starts at the top. And so of my senior management team, 4 out of 9 are racial minorities and 5 out of 9 are female. We understand that when you are making policy from a perspective of being conscientious of how you serve others, that you first have to know who your constituency is and also what their needs are, and then also being empathetic and nimble enough to make necessary change. When we think about basic public policy, for example, having residents have to participate in the cost of repairing or replacing their sidewalk is absolutely prohibitive for a vast number of the people who live in the city of Hutchins. And so one could argue that that is a financial decision, but we recognize that it really has to do with social equity. There are some people who are going to be able to do that and some people who are not. And so we consider all of our policy decisions in relation to who it is that we are serving and within the context of being conscious about their ability, their interests, their needs. And we know that their needs are very different. So we spend a lot of time getting to know and understand the data of who the city is. We do that as a senior management team. We do that through several retreats throughout the year. We do that with our city council. I spend probably 70% of my time educating people people about who Hutchins really is. We spice and dice the numbers so many different ways so that we don't leave people out of the discussion. Most of what we do is never going to have someone walk in our door and give us direct feedback. So we have to seek the information and the knowledge for ourselves to make sure that we are providing what people need. I think if we do our jobs really well, we'll probably hear less and less from our citizens. And so one of the things that we stress here is that our job done well is all about prevention, and prevention never gets a thank you. So, you know, the better we do, sort of the quieter things are going to be, and that should be our motivator every day. If we've done the work, if we've done it well, we will keep the water running, and no one ever calls you to say, man, that was some clean water that came out of my faucet today. But it's the work that we do every day, and it's incredibly important for us.
What a fabulous start to our panel. So next question, I'll start with Aretha, is what tangible goals does your organization have surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion? And who is responsible for making sure these goals are met?
So one of the things we do is we do a lot of measuring. We don't have goals that are established for diversity and inclusion in our organization. But one of the things that our Human Resources Department does is really look at our panels. And so, for example, in areas where we've been completely underrepresented, for example, public safety and fire, there's a concerted effort to how individuals selected in it. We also focus on proven efforts that may be able to pull in that diversity. And so that's basically what we do. Constantly looking at our numbers and monitoring those.
Could I stop you, Aretha? Is there someone who needs to mute themselves? I can hardly hear Aretha.
It's done.
Okay. All right. Trudy?
So much like Aretha, we don't have council adopted very specific goals that are quantifiable. We are maybe in some ways rare that our city council literally reflects our constituency, their age, their race, their gender, education level, so on and so forth. And because they're so reflective of our community, there's really the notion we are inherently knowledgeable and sort of serving the needs in proportion to our residency. I would tell you that in terms of internal management, we certainly ensure that we are seeking to work with vendors that are from female and historically underutilized businesses. We also ensure, especially in departments like Public Works, where these tend to be careers people can get into with very little training to start, but that the city can support them over time to grow into the sort of careers that they can raise their families on, purchase homes on, et cetera, that we are seeking people who are diverse candidates so that they can effectively communicate with residents when they're going out to service their meters or to talk with people about big projects. And certainly in the police department as well. I have chosen to see turnover in our police department as a welcomed opportunity for us to hire in for what we need for the future and not just rehire the same sort of candidate that we have in the past. I sincerely believe that that helps to strengthen us as an organization. And so we've looked for people who may not have sought policing as their primary job when they were younger in their career. We are hoping to have folks who've got a little more maturity about decision making, perhaps a higher education level than what our minimum standards are, but also who represent a varied experience so that we have a team of people who's able to interact with the diversity of our community on any given day. We know that given the fact that we're small in terms of population, and yet we have a very dynamic constituency because of our location between I-45 and I-20 and several businesses, who we serve every day is going to be broader than just our residents. So we have to be able to service the diversity of those needs as well, the many corporations, their employees, so on and so forth. And so we make it a point in an applicant pool that we're looking for people who don't duplicate our existing skill and experience, but that adds something new to our group. I like to say that we're the sort of place where people who think differently can think together. So we work very hard on that cohesiveness, even though we have a wide range of personality types and backgrounds on our team, so that we're focused on people here. We are always, always, always centered on the people that we serve and not ourselves.
Thank you. Liz?
So I would like to say that I think that we see our diversity as a strength in Dallas. In fact, we were just named the 4th most diverse city in the nation. And consequently, we strive to be prioritizing that and leveraging that diversity within our city goals. City manager put out strategic priorities for the year. And for FY 21-22, equity and inclusion is one of those priorities. And so as we see ourselves and our equity work developing, we're looking at it through strategic means, right? We had a resolution that was passed in 2018 approving the Dallas Resilience Strategy. And in that strategy, which I'm happy to share with all, it's multi-pronged, but one of the things that we called out is the advancement of equity in city government through an intentional analysis of how we're delivering services, our strategic plans, and budgeting allocations. And so that's how this office that I oversee and lead, the Office of Equity, was formed as a result of the resilience plan being approved by council. So we continue to build on this foundation in the city, working with our external partners and looking to see how do we, as not only as a city staff, but as previously said, working with our partners, working with collaborative efforts, knowing that we might own some of these inequities that have occurred throughout the ages, but we certainly don't own all of them. It's going to take a full-on community support to overcome some of the disparities that we see in outcomes among our residents within our families. And so we developed a report called the Dallas Equity Indicators Report, and it provides a snapshot by race and ethnicity, and in some cases, socioeconomic status around 5 thematic areas. And so one of them is economic opportunity, education, neighborhood and infrastructure, justice and government, and public health. And so using these indicators to really help us identify root causes and intentional actions to support and shape our city government. So that's the meat and potatoes of the work that I see with our Office of Equity and Inclusion at the city.
Thank you. Next question, I'll start with Trudy, is how diverse is your team, Trudy?
I mentioned in my last comment that certainly my senior management team is incredibly diverse. One of the things that I have been pleasantly surprised by is, as a matter of having such a diverse team and also very open conversation with one another and even problem solving across departments, we're able to help even explain to each other how we should interpret different things. We had a, we'll say, pop-up event that occurred in town, and my view of it, based on my background and experience, was very different than some other members of my team. And so being able to have that roundtable discussion with a group who has done this sort of activity before was a great example of where having that variation made us land at a much better solution than having too many people who were too similar trying to problem solve for the community and trying to not only have the empathy, but also the insight. You know, we can, there's a million things you could call a crime if you wanted to. But there's also ways to understand it's really just a matter of connecting with people and helping to resolve with them in real time. And if you see yourself as a service first organization, you'll put in the work to do that. But as I said earlier, in my senior management team, we're about half female and about half racial minorities, especially when you're talking about police and fire departments. Generally speaking, applicants don't tend to be overwhelmingly female or from racial minorities. And so for us to be as diverse as we are, even as a smaller organization, is something we're really proud of.
Thank you. Liz?
So super diverse. My team is super diverse, and I'm very grateful to be working with people from all over the world. In fact, we have some incredible ERGs, employee resource groups, that they're a reflection of our globe, and so both people who work with us at the city. We're really diverse. We have a staff of about 13,000, and as we have prioritized this as a city manager's goal to be diverse and inclusive, I'm proud to say that my team that I oversee is incredibly diverse, but as important, strives to put equity and inclusion at the forefront of all of our daily tasks.
Thank you. Aretha?
So my organization is working on it. I will say that I am the first African-American city manager. I am the first permanent female city manager. On my team, we have all male department heads. And as we start to look at our organization, I think it's, we have a long way to go. But I also say that diversity goes beyond race. And so when we start talking about religion, sexual orientation, there is a level of diversity within my organization. What I believe in any organization is it should be represented, as Ms. Lewis said, of the population. And so one of the things that Duncanville has is employees who stay for a long time. And so I don't have employees who've been here less than 5, 10, 15 years. And so part of what we struggle with is, as we start to bring in that next level of individuals, is making sure we focus on those types of criteria. As I talked to many of our police officers, everyone I spoke to had been there 10 or 15 plus years. And so as this organization is changing, we are now trying to strive to be more appealing to a more diverse audience.
Thank you. I'm going to kind of saunter over to the economic equity questions. And Liz, I'd like to start off with you. And can you tell us the ways the COVID pandemic has increased economic inequality in your city?
Sorry, I was trying to take myself off mute there. Yes, thanks for that question. And it's something that's one of those questions that keeps you up at night, right? But we have been fortunate in Dallas. We've begun receiving vaccinations, making them widely available. We've received fiscal supports through Congress's CARES Act funding and private and philanthropic investments. So the economy seems to be rebounding, and there are improvements already. People keep coming to Texas and North Texas particularly because I believe we're a great place to work and live. And so we just saw in today's news that North Texas is leading the country in population gains during the pandemic. So those are all sort of hopeful and positive, but we know that when we look at the street level, the ground level, we can see those who have been hardest hit. And that has been a lot of my work at the city over the last year, is being one of the executive liaisons to the ad hoc committee on COVID-19 recovery, economic recovery and social recovery. And in being in that role, been able to work with our Office of Emergency Management, our first responders, our code compliance, our health czar, Dr. Kelvin Baggett, who is overseeing a lot of our efforts and looking at this, and of course the county, our public health authority, looking at how communities were being impacted and noticing who were the hardest hit. So as we all know here, that COVID's pulled the curtain back to see longstanding disparities among our Black, Latinx, API communities, American Indians, women of color particularly, and immigrants. So we have been trying to focus in intentionally to see that, to see what those data points look like. We hear from the Fed that 20% of prime age Black and Hispanic workers were laid off versus 14% of white workers in the same period. We see small business declines among people of color, particularly with 67% of Asian and Black owned firms and 63% of Hispanics having to reduce operations versus 54% of white counterparts. We see that 22% of parents were not working and working less because of childcare, because of at-home schooling. You know, I raised my hand on that one. 30 versus 36 to 30% for Black and Hispanic mothers, disproportionately impacted, right? We've seen that, of course, many people who have contacted the COVID disproportionately represented people of color, Hispanic and Blacks, particularly in the Dallas area. So as we're looking at these hard-hitting facts, we're trying to figure out how do we look at deep-rooted disparities and come out of COVID with a new type of equity, with a new type of inclusion, where we're all playing a role in addressing these long-stemmed, deeply rooted disparities that we have seen over time. So for the last several years, we've been doing this equity work, but now in a post-COVID environment, we have to really step on the gas and do our best to figure out how do we build back better, as they say. And I think we're doing that. We just became a finalist in the All-American City finalist as a result of our equity, resilience, and inclusion work.
Wonderful. Aretha, how would you respond?
I think I would be better in responding since I've only been here a little over 2 months as from my last city. My last city demographics was very different. Of a population of around 34,000, we had about 21,000 individuals in our community that received some form of social services. And so when we looked at our school district, we saw things kick in quickly. Moving to online learning was a challenge for us because we assumed that people have internet access and things like that. And in even giving students the internet access and giving them the MiFi so that they have access, when you have 5 children trying to learn at the same time, you start to see things happen. And so what we were seeing happening from an educational standpoint is we saw our children were getting left behind because the teachers were trying to teach in a new method that they weren't familiar with in a household where they did not have the parents. Now, if we talk about working, well, parents were forced to have to decide, do I go to work or do I stay home with my young child? Many parents were out of work, and so it created other problems for us. When we looked at the social level of it and we started to think about access to basic things like water, electricity, and just general things, all of those came to play, and it became very complicated in our community. And so as we were fortunate when we started to see the vaccine become available is that there was a targeted focus on our community, and that focus resulted in basically making sure that vaccines were available early on to our community. But then you have the other issues that you're striving to deal with, which focuses on the fear, the access, the fear of healthcare providers, and some of the historical things that many individuals fear. And so although you see vaccines available, you see these things happening. From a healthcare standpoint, I will also say the inequities come there because many of the individuals may go with hospitals that are overcrowded and may have symptoms and may be sent home to do self-containment. Well, when you're going home to do self-containment and you may have a large household, you're then causing problems within that household and it's creating a home spread. And so some of the social inequities that I believe were a result of it are things that we will all have to struggle with for years on, specifically from an educational standpoint, and some of the things that our kids lost out on, and even from our family life and the health disparities that were happening and seeing so much happening at one time. And so from a city standpoint, our job there was basically not only to bridge the gap from a conversation standpoint, but also to figure out how can we utilize funding that's available to actually create some sub things to do, whether it was working with our faith-based institution for alternative places rather than the schools for kids to go, to also supporting the parents in ways that many people don't focus on, is parents being at home with their kids, which is something new, making sure they have the types of support they need. And so I think there are a lot of things that we have about 2 years to overcome from the pandemic.
Thank you. Trudy?
In terms of economic inequities during the pandemic, this is the classic tale of two cities, and it depends on who you ask. As a municipality, we were very surprised. We were bracing for something completely different But we were pleasantly surprised to see our revenues actually exploded during the pandemic. The type of industry that we have in our community has sales tax that is not a retail base. It is construction based. So guess what still kept percolating during the pandemic? We sell a lot of steel here. We sell a lot of concrete here. And so we saw ourselves up 25% in sales tax over the last year. We also have corporations that are in the warehouse distribution business. So as people started ordering things online, guess what? More inventory was necessary in all of my warehouses. That increased traffic. Those people stop and buy something to eat in the drive-through and so on and so forth. And so we saw that happening from a city and sort of a corporate side. And at the same time, we started seeing daycares flooded with school-age children for the first time because parents still had to go to work and yet their children weren't able to go to school. And so now we've got these children showing up in a daycare environment, which really is not suited for that age of child. And now we're asking daycare workers to be sort of that substitute teacher with them all day at our daycare facilities. I sincerely believe that the pandemic has shown us what was already there. It has exacerbated the haves and the have-nots and all of the underlying reasons for why people have such different outcomes. We also saw the sort of great divide between the folks who had the sort of jobs where they could work from home and the people who had to show up to work every day. And so the more we saw that essential worker kind of battle with people who work here at the city, with people who are living here in the community, and people who are visiting our various establishments here in the community, we certainly saw a lot of dynamics at play. One of the other things that we certainly recognize is we saw a significant increase in unemployment claims, not for people who had worked for the city. We actually did not lay anyone off. We added hazard pay and did a whole host of things to help support our employees. We even closed our library, but did not have those folks take a pay cut during that time. We just had them work on other initiatives in the city because we felt that it was incredibly important that we keep people whole as much as we possibly can, regardless of their work area. But we saw our unemployment claims go up because people left our organization. They went somewhere else, could have been a year ago, and something happened in that new employer that caused us to be part of their backwards calculation for unemployment. And so we have seen certainly the unemployment office be very overwhelmed, where claims were getting approved before we'd even received the paperwork and had the opportunity to provide any information and data. So again, we definitely see where there were some very significant economic impacts over this past year. And it really depends on the seat that you were already sitting in as to how it affected you and your household.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question before I open it up to the entire group. So, Aretha, let's start with you. Is your city increasing emphasis on economic equity in your economic development plan?
Yes, I brag and say that we were fortunate to recently hire a new economic development director who's spending some time now to do a grassroots understanding of what it is people are looking for and what do we need. A lot of times what we need and what we're looking for don't necessarily go hand in hand, but also looking at an assessment of what is the next phase. Duncanville is one of the older cities in the southern sector, and part of what you see is a lot of development that's been here for a while. And what does that next level development look like? And I think part of that is ensuring that it's things that benefit not only some people, but all people, but also can help to improve the overall status of our organization. And so I do believe there is a particular emphasis on it, an emphasis on making sure that not only do we bring opportunities, but bring opportunities with jobs that are viable for our residents. And as I say, it's a new process for us because we are now starting to think of what does, Duncanville 3.0 look like? What does that next level of Duncanville look like? Many of us know the census reports are about to come out. They're going to tell us things about our demographics that many of us we realize the population increasing, but what does it look like from both a financial standpoint from our residents, but also from a diversity standpoint. And I think it's going to tell a different tale of Texas and many of our areas, and we're going to have to pay attention. And so our economic development strategy has to tie into that factor.
Thank you. Trudy?
So I'd like to describe our economic development strategy as us being catchers. And I have encouraged my council and my economic development corporation to see themselves as pitchers. At some point, we need to be in the driver's seat of our own community and self-determine what it is that we need. And we need to be dogmatic about pursuing that, as opposed to receiving in requests and proposals and simply reacting to someone else's version of what's good for Hutchins. We have advanced our conversations from being all about quantity of jobs and the tax base, both in terms of BPP and real property, to being more about livable wages and higher paid jobs, and creating more of that wraparound community where we are having housing come to the community that can then match those higher level jobs, where people can find themselves in a true synergy in the local community, as opposed to importing in quantities from other communities into Hutchins for shorter term and contract pay. We also are seeking more diversity in the types of jobs that we have here. We understand in terms of that economic equity, if you keep adding to the same industry, at some point that is going to reduce your overall outcomes, as opposed to adding on other complementary pieces of business. And so we've gotten to be much more strategic. Change is hard. I've got people who've owned land here for 25 years, and they're sort of chomping at the bit to be able to turn that 3-generation worth of profit on it. And so it's hard to interject the sort of change that that I've been looking to create here, but it's necessary. And we understand that to be sustainable, we've got to have more than one trick in our bag. And so we have been very, very focused on quantity of jobs in the past, which leads us to have things like a FedEx here. And yet, when you look at the wages that are paid, folks can't pay rent off of a lot of the wages that are paid in the majority of the jobs that are in those types of facilities. It's a very necessary work, and we understand that there is a time and a place, and we're certainly grateful for the opportunity. But we need to do something else and something different. And so that's part of what we're working on at this point in order to create that change.
Thank you. Liz?
Yeah, thank you. And I would say so, Ted. We have a Chief of Economic Development, Dr. Eric Anthony Johnson, and his team, and they're leading this process of developing an economic development policy that focuses on economic growth and sustainability and progress and social progress and inclusivity, as was previously mentioned. And so this policy was recently briefed and specifically addresses upending inequities that have created a racial wealth gap in our community, and most tangibly in the underinvestment and in outcome disparities in certain areas of our city, certain areas that have long been underinvested, where we have seen expansions of recap areas in the last few decades. And we see, these statistics or these reports that where we don't want to be listed, like in the 2016 report of the Urban Institute, finding that we were 272nd out of 274 in terms of economic inclusion. And so we have this audacious goal that we want to be the opposite. We want to be at the opposite end of those stats, and it's not going to happen overnight. It takes a real intention, I think, and prioritizing people whom we know need to be uplifted. Our communities of color, our low-income neighborhoods that have been underinvested in, so to speak, and including our families and our essential workers. Immigrants make up 1/4 of our population in the city of Dallas, and provide, real on the front lines of we have seen during the pandemic. And so it's recognizing the full diversity of our communities and leveraging the strengths that we all bring to this table, and building in on that, in addition to the big anchors, like bringing in the big corporations to town, So in tandem with the economic development policy, the City of Dallas is seeking to establish a new economic development entity. And the entity would support the work of our Office of Economic Development's work. So it would include two functions. One is business development, to recruit, expand, and retain efforts in economic development marketing activities, but also a public developer where we can focus in on communities that frankly need our investment and city-owned properties, as well as conduct land acquisition in support of redevelopment and job growth, especially in historically underdeveloped areas of Southern Dallas, to advance real estate projects that the city could not do on its own. So those are a few of the activities that Dr. Johnson is overseeing, and I'd be happy to place in the chat the briefing he recently gave to our Economic Development Committee, because it is a work in progress. It hasn't been yet finally approved, and so we'll see what the developments are.
That'd be fabulous. Appreciate it. Let me turn to the audience questions, and the first one is from Ahmed Rafi. Is there any effort to find the root cause for the lack of equity and diversity in our communities? Have any of you doing that kind of work?
I'm sorry, Ted, would you repeat that question, please?
Is there any effort to find the root cause for the lack of equity and diversity in your community? I guess trying to figure out how we got here, I guess.
I think what I would say, and just tie something in, is someone, a class I took once at University of Minnesota started out with the statement of what is the problem? And the question is, what are we defining as the problem? Is it something that's, as you said, is it something historical and going back to it? But the first thing is to acknowledge there is a problem. Many people may not see what we are now seeing as a challenge. I will give an example of the city of Longview. And as I started talking about how things were changing and little things, they didn't necessarily see it that way because things have been the same. No one complained about it. And now with all of the social movements going on, more people are paying attention to it. One of the number one questions that you hear people talking about is, what are you doing and what have you done to create equity in a community? But not many people are willing to talk about beyond what are you doing, but what are you going to do long term? What are those long-term growth things? And are you serious about it? And I always say there's two different things. There's a fad and there's a fashion. Is this a fad or is this a fashion? And what we've got to make it into is a fashion, something that is going to keep coming back and keep being addressed and going on. I believe it's changed over time. One of the most interesting conversations that happened when we were talking about, I asked a question in my class of how long ago was Hanukkah invented? And people started giving me dates. But it really shows that we haven't spent enough time educating people on differences, educating people on what things are out there, and making a concerted effort to make sure that our workplace is open and open to them. But part of that is understanding the why. And part of the why is our history. Our history of our country has been a divided organization and a divided culture that really hasn't reached out toward others and other thoughts. And what we have to do as a new generation that's exposed to more is to start to educate people that everything that's not like you is not bad and everything that's like you is not good. And so that's part of understanding and defining the problem and why. But people are looking at it from organizational standpoints, where we look at a shortage of women in government. They're looking at when it's a shortage of minority. They're looking at it from all sorts of things. But what we do about what we discover is going to be the key to this.
And Ted, if I could also say, as important as it is in the public sphere to understand the why, there are some things that you'll never be able to fully articulate. And so our time is probably better spent on creating a non-zero sum game. As long as holding you back benefits me, I'm going to do that. The question is, how do we make sure that this is not about a winner and a loser? How do we ensure that this is about the tide coming in and all boats rising, and that we keep ourselves solution oriented? We will fall apart because of debate on root causes, but we can bind together and be productive as long as we're focusing on solution.
I would just add to that that understanding history and acknowledging past acts and not specific people acts, really, decisions we've made, right, as a government, as a national government, as state government, as local government. That's part of our work. And in the last 2 years, we co-designed with the very dynamic group of Dallas residents this art exhibit that was intended to look at how segregation occurred historically. And it was called Undesign the Red Line in Dallas. And really builds on the book by Richard Rothstein, The Color of Law, which is talking about how some of the acts that our government took at the federal level created the systems and the situations that we find ourselves that impact outcomes today. So rather than looking at housing segregation, for instance, as de facto, he's discussing housing segregation as de jure, meaning intentionally segregating people through laws and policies at the federal, state, and local level. So that is certainly a part of our local work as an Office of Equity and Inclusion. It's a part of how we acknowledge our past, but also how we work to heal some of the traumatic experiences that our residents have lived through, frankly.
Thank you. The next question is from Pamela Burns. And have any of you been looking at changing or adding new benefits for employees in the long run? And I guess it's due to the COVID impact, would be my guess at Pamela's question. And since I know Pamela, after this session's over, she's going to yell at me if I got it wrong.
So we have definitely seen some long haul, if you will, health impacts for folks who have been positive for COVID, if that's where the question, sort of along the lines of the question. So we as an organization are certainly looking at all kinds of abilities to create pools for leave time where people can request donations of time should they have exhausted their time. We want to be nimble as an organization to provide for the needs of our employees so that they are able to provide for the needs of our constituents. We did hazard pay. We certainly, paid for people to stay home and isolate as needed for up to 2 weeks where it does not hit their leave bank of any kind. We also allowed for several iterations of rotating, working from home, in the office, alternative work hours, work schedules. We created work teams so that everyone wasn't there at the same time, so that if there was an exposure, it could be limited to just a few people. If we had to take that whole team offline, we could still function as an organization. So this has been probably the most trusting I've ever had a city council to be, because the dynamic of the situation changed all the time. So policy had to be made without a city council meeting, without a full-blown discussion or people agreeing to it. You just had to do what you had to do day in, day out, week in, week out. And that's something that, we did here as an organization without much fanfare from our city council or from our citizens. So yes, we certainly are revisiting what it means going forward in terms of healthcare and health provisions and those sort of things for the organization.
Thank you. Well, I see we've come to the end of our hour, so I'm going to cut it off, and I want to thank our panelists for being here today and sharing. The most valuable thing they have is their time, and I appreciate you sharing your time with us. And I also want to thank the audience for participating and being here and making this a big success. And I want to say that next year we're going to have another conference, and I must say I'm prejudiced. I hope we get to do it face to face, and we get to be together, and we get to eat some munchies. So I'm looking forward to that, and I want to thank everybody for participating, and I will see you next year or down the hallway in the campus. So thank you, everybody.